I'm going to go ahead and introduce Heather and Caspian. I have only known Heather for a short period of time, and I'm already a big fan. So Heather is the founder and CEO of Caspian Agency, consultant and a keynote speaker. She travels around the country sharing her amazing experience and wisdom with so many people. And you can see her quick bio here. She's an incredible speaker. She has a very impressive roster of organizations that she works with. And we're really excited about Heather's work on high impact hybrid events because Heather is working on a white paper that is extremely comprehensive and covers, I believe at this point, about 13 different types of hybrid events. I see the thumbs up, Heather, which is incredibly intimidating, but also very exciting that someone is putting so much thought and effort into really figuring out what makes hybrid work. So at this point, I'm actually going to stop my screen share so Heather can take over. So here we go. Perfect. So Heather, over to you for screen sharing. And so excited to have you.
All right, thank you. So let me get my screen share open here. And let's see, there we go. And I'll do a quick review. There we go. So I also thank you so much for having me. As usual, I love being a part of Conveners, and this is probably, I don't know, my fourth or fifth time speaking with you guys. So thank you. And as my computer loads, it's been running a little slow lately. I also wanted to say I am joined here by my compatriot, the senior advisor to Caspian. We created a partnership over COVID times. Carl Winston, who is joining us from San Diego State University. That's one of his hats. His other hat is senior advisor to Caspian. And we've worked on a lot of different projects over the last year and a half. So if you want to put any questions in the chat, he might also join in, and he'll be joining me for Q&A afterwards. So thank you, Carl, for joining us. And thank you, everyone else. So I know we've got quite a crowd. We've got quite a bit of information to cover. I'm going to try to keep on time. And of course, Missy, I know I can count on you to give me any high signs if A, we have questions, or B, you need me to move faster. So with that, I'm gonna jump right in. And I know a lot of you, I love speaking to my peers. I feel like we're all in this right now. So I'm giving you my perspectives, my view on what's happening. But of course, like I said, I know I'm in an audience of peers. So I'll be very interested to hear what you are going through as well. So first, when I think about convening considerations, before we get into anything on risk or health and safety plans, it first goes to the why and the who. The what are your tactics, but why are you doing it? And when we think about hybrid, I would say we can split that into why live and why virtual. And the thing about live, I always try to get people to focus on, especially our clients, what is the value, not the budget. We talk about budget a lot, in events, and especially in the nonprofit world, foundations, social good. What is the value? Because we know we're all looking for bigger outcomes and value than just profit. We're looking for social impact. We're looking for societal good. So what is the value intrinsically of your event? And I would actually put a price tag on it. What's the value if we're able to make a dent in climate change? You can do that. But if nothing else, summarize the value of doing it in live. Who is that valuable for? Who is the recipient of that social impact? Now that can be people who aren't attending the event, but by you having this event, that's providing a value and an outcome that they are going to need to have, or it's valuable for your attendees as well. Why? Who is that valuable for? And then the big question now with live, I would say for us to consider as folks working in social good areas, who is left out? And there's a lot of ways they can be left out once we go through health and safety considerations. If you're working in the field in the space of equity, who is left out? So that is a big part of it. The other thing is who is, or when you go to virtual, is why virtual? Well, the best part about virtual is now you're flipping it. Who is included? if you do virtual, who is included? We can go into engagement and all these other things later, but a benefit of virtual is who is included. And then we can, sift through all the rubric of how the equity plays out in that. But I just like to start with there. Why live? Who live? Why virtual? Who's included? So just a quick note. And again, I'm going to go through these fairly quickly because I know that we're going to get to the other stuff. So the other thought around hybrid is whether it's complex hybrid or simple hybrid. And you'll hear me talking about that because I think there's a lot of conflating words out there with hybrid. This is partly why I'm writing the white paper, is really all hybrid is a combination of live and virtual. That's it. That's all it is. And in a sense, there are so many things that have been hybrid already we've taken for granted. Television shows, with a sporting event is hybrid. The Olympics were hybrid. Watching the Super Bowl, hybrid. If you've ever live streamed out your content, you've already done hybrid. It's just some level of mixing live and virtual. That's all it is. Now, a complexity is if you want to mix virtual people into your live event synchronously. That's what we've found as the major complexity, that if you introduce that, you're going to have to spend a lot more thoughtful energy, effort, etc., in making sure those people can actively, synchronously engage with in person. If you don't, there's a lot of ways you can mix and match. And this is going to be in a grid that'll be in a white paper. Again, 13 types and counting. Biggest budget implication in hybrid is going to be really your robust virtual experience synchronously. So if you want synchronously, you want robust, you are, as we've found, at least during COVID at Caspian, you can have different, I'd love to hear different experiences. We've found the staffing and labor shoots up in trying to create a robust virtual experience. And then especially if you're doing it synchronously with anything in person, you are now magnifying your expense. Now, if it's looked at with value, the outcomes of societal value, it might be worth it. And that's why I like to start with value, because if we're, solving climate change, that's a pretty big value that we wouldn't want to fall just because of budget. And lastly, I kind of touched on this already, but types of hybrid, we categorize first by synchronous and asynchronous. And then we mix and match in this grid that will be in the white paper. And that, to me, is how you can start to look at what you want to do. So lastly, on this kind of little intro part is one event, two experiences. So a lot of what hybrid is you're creating one level of content or purpose or value, and you could mix and match of what that means as a thing, two experiences. And I think, these are all my opinions, you can come at me later, I think of an errand for striped paint, as my dad used to call it. Running an errand for striped paint would mean that we're trying to say these experiences are the same, and they're not. And that's okay. And trying to force fit them to be the same experience is not. I've watched the Super Bowl on TV, I've watched soccer games on TV, which is my favorite, and they aren't trying to recreate the stadium for me. Nobody's trying to do that. And so I would say that's not our job. It is a different experience, and allow that person who is watching at home to have an experience that is very singular, separate from this experience. So that's just my own opinion. There you go. But I think there's a lot of precedent for that already. So live streaming, of course, we used to do that. And I think it was really valuable. I watched a lot of live streaming. Pre-event surveys are a great way to have an asynchronous experience. That's a virtual experience. And then I have two blogs. I should try to find the links and I'll see if I can drop them in there. But talk shows and televangelists, oddly, those are hybrid experiences, especially if people are calling in to ask a question on a radio talk show or a live TV show. That is a hybrid experience. And televangelists have really created hybrid forever when people couldn't go to their big mega churches. I have lots of opinions, but anyway, as a model, it's kind of interesting to look at. And then on this question of value, ask your audience what they want. What do they value? What do they need from you? I think so many people get caught up in they have to be engaged. They want that. Well, do they? Have you asked them? I mean, I watch TV every night and Netflix doesn't say, are you engaged? No, and I pay them money every month. I am getting the experience that I really, really want. And I think as we look at audience personas going forward, and this will be more in our hybrid talks that we do later, I think we're going to start to divide audience personas by what they value and the experience they desire, rather than putting our experience desire on them. You have to engage, and when you engage, that equals value. Does it? And I wrote a blog that also talks about questioning engagement as top value. And that's really the parsing of audience purpose. What do they need? How do they consume it? What do they really want from you, and how can you deliver it? So those are just some overarching things about virtual, about hybrid, about how I think about it. I think that's helpful because as we go into your risk and safety plans, we'll start to see that some people may not be included in live. You know, they may have a different experience and desire to come to live. So thinking about their experience and why you're having live versus virtual, how they interact is helpful as a frame, I find, before we even go into health and safety, because it will have ramifications on how people participate. Okay, now I'm going to leave this part and I'm going to go to health and safety. For anybody out there, if you want to put in the chat, who are my optimists out there, or raise your hand or wave? Who are my realists? Who are my slightly negative? All right, there we go. Okay, so optimists, I love you. I am such an optimist. I know I'm not going to sound like it for the next probably 35 minutes or whatever time I have. I'm timing myself, don't worry, to make sure that we get through. But I feel very bad. Optimists, hang with me for just a half an hour. If we're going to talk about health and safety plans, you're going to have to live over in more realism and just a titch of like negative thinking. Sorry, I don't like to do it. It's what's required. We have to play out some kind of negative scenarios. And if you attended my risk management way back when, any risk management matrices, which is a 2x2, is frequency of occurrence and level of impact. So a good way to think about it is I might go outside tonight and get bit a ton by mosquitoes. I'm in Utah, so it's pretty safe to get bitten by a mosquito. I know in a lot of places that's not. For me, that would be high frequency, low impact. Now, the chances of me walking outside and getting struck by lightning, low frequency, high impact. That would suck. So when I talk about some of these things, one of the things we are going to talk about is high impact things, low frequency. And I find my optimists love to live in the place, as I do, of, yeah, but that's never going to happen. Or the chances are very low. That is not how you form a health and safety plan or a risk management plan. The mindset has to be, if lightning strikes, how would it be dealt with in that sense, broadly speaking? So stick with me, everybody, my optimists, my realists, my slightly negative. I love you all. And here we go. Okay, I'm just going to do a teensy coverage. You're going to get the slides, it sounds like, afterwards. So these are 3 slides you can read on your own time later on. I'm going to breeze through them. So excuse me, speaking quickly through them. First of all, we're going to talk through when we talked, gosh, it was last year. We talked about a rubric of considerations about hosting your live event. And we asked a couple questions that are for you to consider. Every event is different. And I think that's important to note. There are certain guidelines of legal or liability. And I did notice we have people, we have people in the US, we have people in other countries, and each country is going to be different, as well as the proclivity, let's say, of lawsuits. America, I think we're right at the top on that one. So I am going to be speaking a bit from the lens of an American perspective. Excuse me a bit on that, but my hope is, because we're the most sue happy, that this will not as much, the ramifications will be lesser in different locales. So first is, how global is your event? How many people are flying in, from where? And then from where are they flying in? Where are the connection points? Where are they flying back to? We're all being conscious of how we're bringing in and pushing out any sort of communicable disease, let alone COVID. I went through the whole Ebola crisis when that was happening, and we had people coming in from that region of the world where there had been an outbreak. So this can mean anything. You always have to consider, where are people flying in, flying from, connection points, any sort of dangers with your live event, and ability to travel. How large is your event? What's the public health capacity and resources of where you're going? Are you overwhelming a small location that and this is again, your group to decide, is going to bring to bear and stress that location? That is a consideration to have. Or are you bringing in your own resources if you're going to a potentially lesser known spot? So the other considerations, let me just let's see here. And my computer, I'm going to need another computer soon. It's like stuck. If this keeps sticking, Missy, I might have you do the screen share, because it's just unhappy with me wanting to move forward.
Yeah, sure. Just let me know.
Okay, let me see if I can get it to move. And if not, then there we go. Yay. Okay. Where is your event taking place? So what is, and specifically I'm speaking about COVID here, what's the local transmission pattern for where your event's being held? If it's ticking constantly up, then you could be looked at as being a little irresponsible unless there's some sort of trend down. And of course that changes all the time, but you'd want to keep tabs on that. Status of local healthcare provisions, again, what's the capacity and what's the local health guidance for where you're going? And lastly, again, we're in the world of trying to think about equity, and that has to be taken into consideration. So what travel restrictions might impact a segment of your attendees? Would they be able to attend another way? Are you convening a high-risk population, potentially with a lower risk population, or with a population that may not have had as much access to the vaccines? Because there's been a lot of age discrepancy and disparities in various different countries. So are the youth okay, and you're mixing these different audiences or groups. And then and this goes back to value, is the very essence of your event being compromised if certain people can't attend? Are you convening something where you're normally used to having the people on the ground with practitioners have a voice in what's being discussed, and now they can't attend? Does that mean your event shouldn't really happen? Or should you do more of a Zoom thing where everyone can take part and get those voices in the room? Or are there other ways of involving them? Could be videos, could be video messages, etc. And lastly, what's the impact? And this is a really tricky one. If you do not convene, are you actually setting a movement back? And maybe there's a way to compromise, involve different voices and groups, because by not doing this, urgency is here. And I'm thinking of something like climate change. We need to address it. The time is now, and not convening is not an option, let's say, for your group. So how do we make that happen? So just a quick review of where that is. All right. So now, your rubric of considerations, you can ask questions about that in the chat. Like I said, now let's get into some health and safety and talk about what this looks like. So the first thing I want to talk about, and some of you may have seen these articles, maybe some not, but I'm a big fan, especially when it comes to liability. And again, speaking from more of a US lens for a minute, is staying in your role. What is your job description? Because I've seen a lot of articles that say, you need to consider ventilation and you need to analyze cleaning procedures. And, if you are not a ventilation expert, you are not analyzing ventilation. If you are not an expert on cleaning protocols, you're not analyzing cleaning protocols. What you need to make sure you do is you stay in your expertise. In America, as soon as you're stepping outside of your role, you're not helping your situation, you're actually harming it, and you're introducing a level of liability, because you're basically saying, I'm kind of like a surgeon, and I'm checking up on the surgeon to see if they're doing it the right way. Well, now if you have any impact or influence in what that surgeon is doing, and I'm saying basically the ventilation expert or the cleaning expert, you could have been seen as interrupting their expertise. And since you're not one, that's not good. Now, again, That's American law or potential consequence. This will vary. I am not as internationally legally versed. So you'd want to see what here we call Good Samaritan laws are in your country. There are some that cover us here in the US, and there's a lot that don't, which is really crazy if you ask me. But you know, you can help a person and actually get in trouble, which is not that great. But just make sure you do that. And what is your country's view? So there could be an American view, but as soon as I go to a different country, I need to see the host's country's view of my role. Now, sometimes that can be more responsibility. So if I'm working in England, they could see me as an event professional of having to do and know more than I might have to know in America. So that is a very critical part, is you got to stay in your role and you need to know what your role is. Last thing I'll just say, vaccination cards. There's been a couple articles in the event news in America saying, you know, what about counterfeit vaccine cards and how do we check? Are you a counterfeit? This is always the question I ask myself. Am I a counterfeit expert? No. Okay, well, then that is not my role. I can hire a counterfeit expert, but I'm not going to become one, or else I need to change jobs. So always think about what's your job, what's your role. F&B, same thing. All right, next step. Here we go. Now that you know you need to stay in your role, you need other people that are in their roles, which is experts and policies, and they help you create these. You assemble a team of experts. First of all, that is your role. Your role is to assemble experts as a producer. Who and what should be regularly consulted, and you set up a protocol of how often, because this is a changing dynamic atmosphere, they should be consulted. So the WHO, as we know, WHO, CDC, the venue is actually now a part of your expert plan. Airlines are a part of your expert plan. Visa agencies are a part of your expert plan, and all of them have policies in place. So you need to know all of those policies. Create a structure for these regular updates. This is a part now of a brand new communication plan that you need to have within your role. This is within your role. You've got to know the regular updates from the experts. They decide it, but you actually know the communication for it. And then you have to talk with them, and I'll give an example on the next slide. What are the ramifications of the policies and guidelines that might be crafted by your team of experts? What is the enforcement protocol? Once you have policies and guidelines, you have to enforce them. Policies are meant to be enforced or have consequences. And what are the downsides of those consequences of enforcement? A lot of folks sometimes don't think this part through. They'll think through, we should do this, and we want to do this, and this is what we're going to do. Well, and I always ask, well, then what? Which we'll go through a couple more of those scenarios. So just as an example, we'll talk about, you know, what requiring masks does. So let's say you're going to say, we want to require masks for everyone who attends, vaccinated or not, doesn't matter. Great, that's wonderful. I'm not here to judge or pass judgment on any policies that might be created. The only thing I want to do is ask questions and put in all your minds what the questions are that you ask after you put in place a policy. And this is where I go into my negative and realist people, and my poor optimists have to now put it on a different hat. So everybody wears masks. It's awesome. It's awesome. And everybody just wears masks, and it's awesome. My realist, yeah, but not everybody wears masks. My negative, no, somebody's going to take it off, and then what we do. I like you negative people, because that's how you build a plan for what happens if. So no, they're not going to wear them. Great. Who enforces it? And again, what's your role? Are you a security person? No. Now, you are a person that might mention guidelines, and so might your volunteers or your staff. That could be in their role. But what if I really don't want to do it? I don't want to put on my mask. And I have reasons. Okay, well, who removes them if that's the consequence? Is that security? Is that venue security? Is that your private security? Who is that? What happens? Do they actually remove them from the event? Do they let them watch virtually? Do they give them a refund? What do they do? What's the action steps? And I always ask myself, what does it look like on Twitter? Somebody takes a video of themselves and they are a result of your enforcement. They take a photo, they do a video, and they post it on Twitter. What does your enforcement policy look like on Twitter? And if it can be defended, great. I'm not saying it can't be. But you want to think about, what does it look like on Twitter? And my negative people, you are loving this, because you're like, oh, I think about exactly what's going to look like Twitter. It's going to be bad. Great. What does that look like? How can we mitigate that? How can we Or how can we say, hey, we're all going to be okay with this, and we write up a policy internally and say we're accepting what someone might put on Twitter, and actually we feel good about it as a company. And then the basis, I always say, when is it not required? Are you going to require masks until 2065? Are you going to require masks till 2025? If you're not, then there must be something in your head that is saying that there is a time and a criteria under which you would not have that. And we're going to talk about that later. I just want to put that in your head right now so that you have that in your head of what you could be thinking about as a basis of potential stopping a policy, which is always good about a policy. Should it ever stop? The next part of your health and safety plan. So you have your team of experts. You've come up with some policies and guidelines. You're thinking through enforcement. Communication plan. How do you let everybody know you have these policies, you have these guidelines, you are coming up with them? How do you let people know what they are? And this is before, and then we'll talk about in case. So before, tactics, tone. I always like to say thorough and thoughtful. That's our guidepost for Caspian is your communication thorough? And again, we're in the world of, social good, societal good. Let's make it thoughtful. Let's take those moments and consider how people feel about some of these things, which, we're in a scary time. We're in a dynamic time. We're a little uneven. So make it thoughtful, but make it thorough and make it adaptive and inclusive. So how can this communication plan adapt to a changing environment? You might have to start writing more communications than you've ever sent. So you might write them and they never go out, but you've got them because they're adapting. The latest news from our experts is X. And so because of this, we will do Y. And is it inclusive? This is where I do think virtual is a great panacea for a lot of event producers. Again, taking into mind the considerations we put up earlier, which is how you want to have that lens of equity always as you look at policies and guidelines. But if you determine virtual is a great way to be inclusive, so how can you both adapt to a changing environment and be able to send communications that do that, and also send communications that are very inclusive of, hey, these are some different ways you can engage. There could be a ton of them. And then this is the part, my optimists, they're like, we don't need these next things. My realists are like, yeah, you probably do. My negative people, you're like, of course we do, because everything will go wrong. I like you, because again, you're my people during this talk. In case communications. So if things go sideways, if you've gone through, okay, what happens if this, if this, if this? What happens if these different things occur? You've got to have your in-case communications in your plan ready to go. That means your attendee list is ready to go to send them. There's been a change. Heathrow Airport is locked down. You have to have your vendor list. We take care of our vendors, right? All the venues, all the photographers, the videographers, the car drivers, the bus drivers. You have to have them with any of your in-case communications and make sure they know. And then you've got to have your financial policies ready to go and be administered, because everyone, in case of a cancellation, a big switch, you need to change your flights. You need to now stay in quarantine for 2 weeks on the ground. The first questions, beside making sure my health is taken care of, is who's going to pay for it? Am I stuck with the bill? So you got to play through these scenarios of what happens if you write a communication that's an in case, like, what if this happens? At the very same time you're writing it, you have to be like, well, then who would pay for that? Who would be responsible financially for paying for that? And again, don't forget your vendors. I'm a big fan. Our vendors are like family in a lot of the countries we work in, and we do not want them to be left high and dry, and neither would you. So some people think first of their attendees and their speakers and their staff. Don't forget those darn vendors when it comes to your in-case communications and your financial policies. All right. So next is risk.
Heather, so sorry to interrupt you. Could you go back to communication for a second and touch on communication plans and why we don't have any current templates, and kind of what you offer, what Caspian offers in terms of communication?
Yes, absolutely.
Plans?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we don't have one because every single one of them is very, very, very customized. And I would say if we threw one out there, we'd probably have someone in the audience go, well, that doesn't sound like our group, or we wouldn't do that, or we would always pay for everyone no matter what. Or another group would say, well, we would never pay for them, or we can't pay for them, or we would cancel in case of that. And so this is a lot of questions. A communication plan is not a fast thing to do. It takes almost every stakeholder in an organization to agree upon what the messages and the consequences are. And yes, frankly, this is what Caspian gets paid to do. So it's really help somebody through those processes and ask those questions. But it really is that they are so individual.
Heather, there's another question in the chat that you might want to take on at this point. It's from Linda, and she's talking about she's working with optimists like me, who there's no problem, no problem. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how do we overcome our optimists if we're trying to put together a risk management strategy?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because that's exactly what it is. And that's why optimists really, from a deep personality perspective, don't want to do it. You know, you're almost asking an introvert to become an extrovert, or vice versa. So it's kind of ingrained in us, I think, about how we see the world. And I mean, I'm an optimist, so it's hard for me to talk about this stuff. But I think what we need to do is play out some of the what ifs. And most of the time, and I hate to say it, but even an optimist will perk up if you talk about financial ramifications. So if you start to say to them, hey, in the case that this happened, I'm seeing a potential financial consequence of, $300,000. Why? Well, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I need to let you know that if we didn't have a policy and people get stuck here, legally, we could be left holding the bag in England with a doctrine called custody of care or duty of care. And if I didn't tell you that, then you wouldn't be aware of it. And I find the money place is the one place with our clients. None of our clients want to think about negative things. We've been able to get them to perk up, or at least the financial person. And I find a lot of financial people are your negative people. And you can get them on your side. So it also could be something that you work with a financial person to say, obviously, I don't want to be negative or think bad thoughts about anything, but we need to prepare financially if this ever occurred. And I do also say showing them a matrices of that, the 2x2 of likely or impact, level of impact and likelihood of occurrence is really helpful too, to frame the thinking around risk. And that's a worldwide known matrices to say we at least have to agree to this. So thank you. Okay. And I know, Missy, I was looking at my time. I'm like, I will. I think I can get through these because the rest of them are a little shorter. So now we want to mitigate some of the risks that we've talked about. So we've got our experts, we've got our policies, we're thinking through some of our enforcement, and now we know some of the risks, so we need to mitigate them. And you can't always say they're never going to happen, because again, my realist, it is. So let's protect your event, your organization, and I always say, and you. And again, thinking about some of my more American folks that have to, again, not be sued personally, which we can do in the US. It's a little scary to think about, but also your event and your organization, you want to protect them. Waivers, interesting case law in the US now. And I always say, look to Disneyland. What is Disneyland doing? My guess is, out of everyone on this phone call, I don't know your organizations, Disneyland has more lawyers than all of us combined. So Disneyland has lawyers in all these different countries. So trust Disneyland. And they're doing basically a waiver online. Airlines also doing, in a sense, a waiver where you check a box and you're saying, I acknowledge risk. Ski hills are dangerous places where you hurtle yourself down a hill on ice and 2 sticks. They have waivers. So look to these waivers. They have protected people, and sadly, bad things have happened at each of those locations I've mentioned, and yet there has been some coverage with waivers. Signage, got to put up signage. So the best part is there is great signage at Disneyland. I took a ton of pictures of it. And all that signage is, as you walk in, you're acknowledging things, and it's assumption of risk, which is a great thing to know about. Assumption of risk says, yes, I understand there is risk, in a sense, just by walking out my door. So protect your organization by accessibility. Know the laws in your country, in your venue, where you make it accessible, and accessible can be virtual. So that's good to know. As long as you're allowing for some level of accessibility for your event. And that case law is starting to move all the time. So you've got to keep an eye out for that. So let me just say, somebody is knocking at my door. So, okay, good. Zoom, right? And then first aid and security, protect your organization by having some first aid, having security on site, making sure you have the people on site that can actually attend to your individuals. And then protecting you also, as I mentioned, that Twitter mark from optics and realities. So you need to have training and talking points for everybody along the line. So your staff, your volunteers, and your venue and your vendors, because you can potentially have somebody who does something at the venue and says, oh yeah, this organization doesn't allow that. Or your vendor, heaven forbid, your photographer says to somebody, oh yeah, we didn't allow that. So have some of that, have them sign something and acknowledge that they did take your training and they do know your talking points. Okay, so then financial considerations. All right, I'm going to do this. You want to think about your contracts. And again, this is where we go to budget and value and what's right for you and your organization. Some of your organizations are huge, very well funded, and you're like, we're going to pay for everything no matter what if it happens. Not everybody has that financial ability in an organization. So you need to protect yourself and your organization financially. And that can happen in the form of contracts to mitigate some of that financial outlay. Force majeure. Everybody loves to look at force majeure. I love force majeure, my favorite little thing. It only covers acts of God. So if there was a strike, that's an act of man, and then if you had Heathrow decide that they were going to shut down, that's an act of man, human, I should say, but that's the writing in current contracts is humans caused that. God didn't. And so that's traditionally a force majeure. So you need something additional into that. And there's two things that have come into play lately because of COVID, and you should know about them. I think of them as very, very similar. Commercially impracticable and frustration of purpose. Now, commercially impracticable means it doesn't make any sense. You cannot actually do it from a commercial perspective. And that could be that you couldn't fly into Heathrow. It was commercially impracticable to do your event because it's in London. Frustration of purpose would be different. That would mean that all your people, Heathrow's open, but an airport in Kenya is closed. And actually your whole event is called Kenya Comes to London. Well, that's a frustration of purpose. It's very commercially practicable because anybody can fly into Heathrow, but your purpose is frustrated because actually your on the ground group can't get there. So this is all where I know Missy and I were talking about, contracts and templates, and you have to go to a lawyer, or you really have to know your contracts, because what you don't want to do is have any of these clauses conflict with each other. If they do conflict, at least in American law, both clauses are thrown out, and guess what? You're in court to figure everything out. The one thing you don't want to do is go to court because it's very, very, very expensive. So you have to make sure that you understand how each of these clauses might relate. And if you only need commercially impracticable or frustration of purpose, which I think is true, I prefer frustration of purpose because you can make it broad. You don't want it so broad it can't be enforceable, but you do need to define your purpose if your purpose is going to be frustrated. And then, of course, postponement and rollover. Usually an easy thing to get nowadays. So it's not the greatest. Your money is out the door. Your cash flow is out the door, but you postpone and roll it over to a better date. Other places of how you can mitigate risk financially, insurance, of course. Right now, we're telling every one of our clients, just buy refundable flights. Like just if you don't want to have to worry about it, buy a refundable flight. We're thinking of that as insurance. We want them to think about that as a line item for insurance. Yeah, but what if it doesn't happen? Well, I don't get in car accidents every day, but I have car insurance. So make sure you have that. Speakers, you can actually get insurance if a speaker doesn't show. It's a very specialized type of insurance. And it basically says it's kind of like frustration of purpose, which is this, everything is based around Archbishop Desmond Tutu coming. If he doesn't come, our event's done. Well, if he can't come, you can get speaker insurance that if he isn't able to attend, they cover the refunds of your attendees. cool little insurance to know about right now. Then of course, travel insurance, most of you know about that. I would absolutely recommend that. Put it in writing for every single one of your attendees who actually has to fly to get to where you are. So, okay, then we go to our requirements and considerations.
Oh, Heather, so sorry, you might want to refresh your slides for a hot second.
Okay, let me do
my bad, everyone.
Oh, no.
While Heather refreshes that, I just dropped a comment in the chat about online webinars where lawyers will talk about these types of clauses and contracts that you can access for free. But again, avoiding those cookie cutter contracts.
Yes, that is my biggest note is cookie cutter contracts are not your friend, and whoever is your most logical human, that's who you actually want to be thinking through your contract, besides, your lawyer, of course. Because once you get to thinking through these clauses, they have to logically connect. And that's the biggest part of making sure you don't have to throw out your entire contract and then end up in court where a judge gets to decide what he thought or she thought or they thought you meant. Okay, and it'll take a minute to load. There we go. Wow, I gotta really get rid of my cache in this computer. I have a risk management situation right here on my laptop. Okay, requirements and consequences. Yay! Don't worry, there's only 2 more slides after this, people. Stick with me. We can do it. Okay, so requirements and consequences. A lot of our clients are talking about we're going to require everyone who attends has a vaccine. Do I have opinions on these things? I would say from a consultant point of view, it's actually probably a wise liability move, potentially, because you could probably have more coverage from a liability perspective. Now, do you want to do this? I don't know, because your organization is going to have to make a call based on all those considerations we talked about. Where are people coming from? What kind of audience? Is this equitable? Have you made it accessible? Where are your optics and where are your realities? So, so first of all, if you're going to require that, let's talk about the then what. Apps or hard copy. Do people have to bring a card or can they upload it through an app? And now we're already hearing about the Green Pass, which is going to be in the EU, what Italy is requiring, what Germany is requiring, how they're going to play that out, how you have to upload it. So there's a lot of really interesting things on how you prove it. So we're going to require vaccines. Well, then what? How do you implement it? And how do you assure it? And again, not thinking anybody's a counterfeit expert out there. If you are, great. If you're not, you don't get to figure out if they're counterfeit or not. Testing. This is a tricky one. Man, this is tricky. Because are you going to do it daily? Are you going to do it regularly? Are you going to let people leave once they've been tested? So if you do testing and you allow a group to go out and mingle with untested, you would, if you were being very strict about protocols, have to test again. So testing it's a fraught logical puzzle. Because if you're creating a bubble, and the NBA in the US is a good thing to look at, once they tested, the people had to be in the bubble, and there was nobody else allowed in the bubble. The other thing to think about with testing and vaccines is what is the protocol for your vendors and for your venue? If your venue isn't requiring it or your vendors aren't requiring it, then you've got a whole nother logistic piece you have to coordinate around testing or requirements for other staff into your bubble. If you're really creating a bubble, you got to create a bubble. Otherwise, you got a bubble with holes in it. And we know a bubble with holes is no bubble at all. So you do not want a holy bubble. Keep that in mind, no holy bubbles. So these are really important things to think of. Then what? Daily health symptom check. So are you going to have people check on an app? Do they have to show up? Do they have a fever check, a temperature check? What kind of temperature are you going to do any of those? And then social distancing, are you going to require it? Because that would impact your numbers that you can sell tickets to. It impacts your max capacities in rooms. I know a lot of us already know that, but the revenue perspective can be really interesting, as can your audience mix. If your room capacity shrinks and you need a certain sprinkling of different types of people or regions or whatever, now you have fewer people that can represent those regions, those diverse categories. you have shrunk your ability to have a recipe of humans. And that is an important thing to think about with social distancing that's usually not considered. The other big thing for all my negative people out there, or my realists, or even my optimists that are like, all right, I'll put on my hat. If you put on your hat, what's my big then what about this slide? All my optimists, we're all assuming like, and then I did it, and that's awesome. Yay. Somebody's sick. You test somebody and they're COVID positive. You do a daily health symptom check and they check them all. What happens? How do you then manage your event? Who then goes into quarantine? Are they taken care of by you? Do you make sure that they are set up in a hotel for 2 weeks in Barcelona? Is that on you? Do you pay for it? Do you have to quarantine the whole tent that everybody was getting a test in? Does everybody have to be tested again? Again, not for you to decide. The experts will decide this for you, but you should ask the question, then what? We get a positive response. We get 5 positive responses. They all went out on the town last night. Then what? And that is a big then what to think about. Comfort versus legal. There are some things that are comfortable. There are some things that are legal. You need to know the difference. So comfort is, what do I feel comfortable doing from your audience? Does your audience feel comfortable without masks? Do they feel comfortable with everybody being vaccinated? Do they want to feel comfortable with social distancing? Even if none of that was required or in a policy or legally required. What is the comfort? And for data say survey, 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 survey. Start to parse, just like we put at the very beginning, your audience by need and by experience that they want. And that nobody wants an uncomfortable experience. So you got to figure out what's their comfort in this whole strata. And then consult your expert team about what is comfort and what is legal. Again, you don't have to be the legal expert, but you do have to have one. And there's been a lot of talk about HIPAA. Even I talked about HIPAA last year. And I was thinking, oh, you can't ask about vaccine status. You got to worry about that. And now, as we've seen case law, at least in the US, I believe this follows to EU countries. And I'm not sure past that. I had to study because our clients are mostly just EU, US currently. We usually do other countries and continents once we go, but those are our 2 I focused on. HIPAA is irrelevant unless you're sharing health data between professionals. That's a US centered legal parameter. So anyway, you don't have to worry about that anymore if you're in the US and if you want to ask about vaccine status and have that be stated. Little note. Okay, last slide. I'm doing it. Okay, guidelines and principles. As you are designing your health and safety plan, the biggest thing, and I mentioned this before, but now I really want to bring it home because I've been talking about consequences and enforcement, etc., is what makes your guideline and principle start? You have to know that. We're all in COVID, but we could be in something else tomorrow. So what is the threshold that's making it stop or making it start? And then you have to know the corollary. What makes it stop? What makes your guideline or principle stop? Is there a time where you would stop requiring vaccinations? Maybe not, maybe never, but you have to write that down or decide it. Are you always going to have social distancing? Maybe you are. Maybe that's it. We're just doing that. Maybe you're not. What makes it stop? And same with masks or any other protocol. Are you always going to care about ventilation? Are you always going to care about talking about refundable tickets? I don't know, but you have to know what makes it stop. And for that, I would say, what statistics are driving that? What locations? It might be driven by location. Well, this is our guideline principle here, but if we get in a location where they don't have as much health support or anything else, we would do something else. Because you want a broad enough guideline or principle health and safety plan for your live events that it can encompass anything that's coming down the road. Because I hate to tell you, these diseases do not take a number at the bakery for the next donut in line. Ebola still out there, Zika, SARS, the flu. What are your policies around communicable diseases? And do you put them all in the same bucket? Or do you have different buckets and guidelines based on outbreak for a different communicable disease? Because right now everybody's got COVID in their face, as we should. But I hate to say it, and this is where I sound Debbie Downer, is there could be another one pop up. There could be 3 at once. They could be having a party. So how do we put a guideline into place? And then there's other crises and risk potentials. This is where I told you, optimists, you've got to stay with me because this slide is probably the hardest slide to get through. It's my last one, don't worry, but we're gonna probably end on a happy note. I know Missy will have some sort of wonderful tree bird singing hummingbird link after this, because this is a hard slide. What about other crises and risk potentials? I mean, I've gone through fires, volcanoes, heart attacks, broken ankles. I mean, everything that you could probably have, and some I'm glad we haven't. But how can these principles of health and safety and custody of care and duty of care apply to any other danger or risk potential? Because if it does, you're going to start to see more guiding principles that move your organization forward in any scenario. Otherwise, you're going to be spinning up a new one for every new disease, every new problem, every new crisis, every new thingy thing. And if you're thinking more about how do we custody the care, how do we look at a rubric of when we decide to do a live event, how do we think about our accessibility, how do we think about how we want to enforce a policy or a thing that we want to have at our event and actually remove people if they don't comply, and we're okay with it on Twitter, we're okay with it on TikTok, no matter what, and if the hotel burns down, which I've gone through, we would put people up in a hotel. Or we are setting aside money every time we do an event in a fund. I don't know what it is. And I know a lot of folks out there, there's small organizations and maybe our risk potential is we're going to insure across the board for X. I don't know, but these should be broader plans than just COVID, because I think this is one place that we're going to have to be a little more malleable. And that will set it up well for you. So I'm going to stop screen share so that if you wanted to go back to share, Missy, you can, and my computer will still operate faster. All right, I'll pass it back to you. And now I'm joined truly by Carl in this.
Awesome. Heather, that was amazing. And you stayed on time, which is incredible because you had so much to go through. Great. So you guys, we're going to take about a good 20 minutes or so for Q&A with Heather and Carl. And Heather, if you want to touch on the difference between what you and Carl, like where your expertise lies, or like a really high look at the biggest questions clients are bringing you and what Caspian focuses on right now, great. Otherwise, I encourage you guys to ask questions as detailed or as general as you would like. And if we have a lot of questions, we might do 2 breakouts, but otherwise we'll stay together so everyone can hear the great questions and answers. So take it away.
Yep, and I will say, and Carl, you could always say something else, but I would say that really what I focus on is more of the contractual kind of framework thinking around communication plans and how you might apply these or think about them. Carl is on the ground at San Diego State going through this in real time with students, with faculty, with board meetings, as well as has extensive knowledge and experience at hotels and venues, and oversees several large hotels and venues, and can speak to how they are thinking about it, looking at it from that perspective. So Carl, I know I'm putting those words in your mouth, but there you go. And I think we're gonna have lots of questions.
Yeah, I was gonna say too, Heather, I know for a lot of us who are actually produce and plan events locally and globally, one of the factors that relates to risk is fear. And I think every one of us is dealing with stakeholders who have fear. You talked a little bit about the pessimists informing your risk strategy, but I'm wondering if it might be if others are experiencing a fear factor from their stakeholders in planning their convenings right now, and how big a role is that having in their day-to-day lives right now.
It looks like Brian has a question. Go ahead, Brian.
Thank you, Missy. What do you guys think about fully vaccinated conferences and meetings? What would that take? Is it something for the future, or is it something for now?
So I'm seeing it right now. We are talking actively to clients. We're requiring a fully vaccinated conference. And we've already seen a couple take place in the event world. One was called, I think it was called Conveners. And the way it occurred, though, again, talking about a holy bubble, I know it sounds weird, but we would want to make sure that if you did that, then you have everyone who's vaccinated there, And if you want to make sure people are tested on the way in, or at least do symptoms check, I think that adds one more layer. But people are absolutely doing it. In the US, that has been upheld so far. That has not been found to be a problem legally. And I have to give a call out to Jana. I have that mug.
Annette, go ahead.
So when you talk about vaccinated and tracking people, like where they're coming from and where they're going back to, I'm going to a hybrid event in Colorado this weekend. And one of my colleagues who is coming from Washington now opted out. Most people are going to be vaccinated, but he's got small children. So just, I'm just underscoring your point about the mixture of people that are vulnerable. So he had to make the call. And while we didn't use a risk matrix, that was basically what we were doing. What is the risk of him carrying something inadvertently home to his small kids? And so that made it a no-brainer for what we did. But I think that visual is also a really good way for people to get their feelings into words and have clarity.
Yeah, it's a high impact occurrence, even if it might be low frequency statistically. And that's why that's important. I mean, that's usually why we have risk management plans. I mean, all the protections on roller coasters are for high impact, low frequency. If you fall off a roller coaster, that's high impact. Does it happen? Low frequency.
Awesome. Let's go Linda, then Lee.
Hi, Heather, voice from the past from Coro. I would love if you would talk a little bit more about inclusivity. My upcoming event is an employee event. People aren't opting in. They are being asked to attend this event. They are being given the option to not attend if they don't feel comfortable. But the school of thought with some of the folks on program is they're not going to do anything virtual. And I thought that was that it was going to be too much hands-on, too much team building, but you really hit a nerve when you said inclusivity. So you're basically telling someone that's not comfortable, they don't get to get the information in the timely manner. So just would love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would be curious what the value, I mean, most organizations at this point in time have a value statement, a mission statement, how we live our values statement, all of those. And I would map that to this action and say, if these are out of alignment, then there's ways we can bring them into alignment. And honestly, this is potential a budget impact, but it's not as big as I would have thought. Is renting iPads now. I know it sounds crazy, but iPads are not as expensive as they used to be to rent. And if you have everybody do an iPad, you could even use their phone, which is almost a zero budget impact. And you set up iPads for people to go do one-on-ones with the people who are not in the room. Again, anytime you bring in virtual synchronously, you're adding complexity and potential budget. So this is both complexity and budget. But it's a low lift. I would say it's on the lower side of the complexity and the lower side of the budget. Or you could even have rented laptops set up. Those are usually pretty affordable too from an AV company. So at least they're getting some, and I like one-on-one interaction. For virtual involvement of people, if you're going to try to have a synchronous experience, I like one-on-one. Otherwise, it's like, why am I here? It's like trying to zoom me into the Super Bowl. Hi, everybody. Why am I here? Whereas if I zoomed into somebody at the Super Bowl, and so what's it like in the VIP room? Can you let me talk to the dude or whatever? I'm into soccer. I'm using Super Bowl, but my thing would be, I want to talk to Abby Wambach. I'm bummed she's still not playing. I loved her. That is maybe a tactical way that could answer that. But I'd start first with values. Carl, I know you deal with a lot of this type of stuff at San Diego State.
Sorry, I'm just unmuting myself here. I got a little background noise. Apologize. It's a tricky issue. I'm not sure I have a black and white answer for it, though. It's sort of shifting. sands are shifting beneath my feet as I'm trying to come up with policies and procedures to deal with this stuff. And I keep telling my stakeholders, the only thing I know is it's going to be different next week, which is hardly a solid ground, and it doesn't make me feel great. But I wish I had a more optimistic answer, Heather.
Thanks, Carl and Heather. Let's do Ling and then Ashley.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for your great presentation. So I'm calling in from a location in Canada, and our government's been rolling out proof of vaccination with different provinces sort of requiring that now. And I'm curious if you've had a situation where you have proof of vaccine for guests and vendors, but it's not been required as a condition of employment for your staff, but it's been strongly recommended. So
Right.
Guests might be arriving at a remote community with the impression that they're entering a bubble, but it's not. And
Right.
we do all the sanitization and the health checks, but it's remote community and we don't have 100% vaccination on our team. So I'm
Right.
curious about like communications around that, if you've dealt with that situation.
Yes, we have. It is tricky. Because, and this is where I would, again, this is where the expert team and us staying in our lane has really helped us have some of those conversations, because what we've said is, what would an expert recommend to create the strongest bubble, kind of a level 2 high statistically probability you have close to 100% of what you can do, but it's not 100% vaccinated, and what are the potential consequences? And then level 3, just testing and groups of this. And I would go to expert recommendation, because what we've said at Caspian, and we have varying, folks on our staff, is that we conform to the client's requirements for on-site events as a company. So that is a condition in a sense of our company. And yet we do have ways that our team can still work remote, which is great. That inclusivity part, there's a lot. I mean, we work remote all the time anyway. It's the on-site piece that changes for any of those particular individuals if that conflicts with the client's policy. So that's one way we've handled it. I would say the other thing is, if you talk to the experts and they say, okay, all vaccinated, for those not, is it test? And this is where I don't know. This is why I would go to an expert and be like, that's what they said. Is it a test in the morning, a midday symptom check, and a test in the evening? Is that what now has to be done on this side? And then do they say, yeah, you've got a pretty, it's not airtight, it's got a little teeny leak, but the leak is so small as to be statistically insignificant. And I don't know if that's true, but I would want everyone to know that. I would not leave. There's actually a case study, and now it's going to become case law, where there was a resort in Seattle that actually had a case of COVID. It was last year. They did not inform the guests, and the guests sued. So it's a different scenario, but the informing of how strong the bubble was, in a sense, is really kind of the guiding principle that's being laid out there. Is it has to be very clear so that the people can make the choice themselves.
I just want to add, Heather, that the standard has become self-attestation, where we attest that we're vaccinated or that we're COVID-free. It's not perfect. I mean, the reality is, from a risk management perspective, you can ask for assurances. Disney just said we're mandating all our employees are vaccinated. They didn't. If you have to read through the press release street in 60 days from now. So are you safe or are you not safe at Disney? And by the way, can they control their guests? We all know they probably can't. So up and down the supply chain and the audience chain, you have self-attestation as the standard right now. And is it foolproof? I don't think so.
Awesome. Let's do Ashley and then Jana.
Hi, this is super interesting, and I'm in New York City, and we just had a vaccine mandate come out for all indoor dining, and it's honestly been the most helpful thing for me, because our board back in July had been we're really nervous about mandating vaccines because it turns into an equity issue, and it's some of our guests had been to events where they found it was very controversial. So we're sort of feeling a little bit, and even like on the employee side, our employees, if they're not vaccinated, they're also subject to this. They can't go to this event if they're not vaccinated. But one of the questions I have is, we're now having to sort of start to turn to our staff and get a sense of, are you even comfortable working this event? I think that right now we're part of our decision making is like, A, do we even have guests that want to come to this event? I have a boss in London who's like, 100%, everybody wants to go to an event. And I'm like, I don't know. I'm here in New York and we're having a very different conversation over the last 10 days. But the other thing is we're starting to say, are we even going to have the amount of staff we need to work this event? And in order to have all these extra checkpoints to check the mandatory vaccine, which we are required to do by law at this point, we're going to need a lot more staff. And I'm just not even sure how I can kind of comfortably ask my colleagues, are you willing to work this event? And I don't want to end up in like a tricky thing with that. So I'm curious if you have any advice on how to proceed there.
Just so interesting, because we had a Caspian wide call yesterday and this exact thing came up, because we do international events, one of them England, and some people were saying, I don't know if I even want to do that. And that hadn't come up before. And so, again, with how much planning we do remote, the on-site portion is probably just with you guys like this window. So from a perspective of, as a boss, I want to make sure they still get their income, but we're likely going to have to do some transition for people who are on the ground in that location to take on this work for some of my staff that don't want to be on site. So at least they get the experience of, some of the planning portion, but they may not want to go on site. And so we're looking at that as a bridge. The second thing that I thought was fascinating, and also, from your perspective of a labor issue yesterday that one of my staff brought up, and I thought it was extremely insightful. I was going to try to bring her on today so I can give her credit, is she said, wait a second, when we're on site, Heather, we're all in. We're waking up at 6 a.m. We're getting, we're jet lagged. We're working till midnight or 1 a.m. And I don't always, we usually have night managers and stuff, but you're in it. And it's helpful sometimes that the people who know the most are up for 14 hours. She goes, I don't want to do that anymore. We can't do that. We can't run ourselves down from a health perspective, because now that is actually potentially deadly for me to be really run down. So this would change our model of staffing on site. Even with the people that want to go on site, we need to double up with a lot more. And again, I try not to work people that way, just so you all don't know. I'm not like, but some of these things happen. It's like, oh, you were doing this, and we're all running around. So which I'm glad about, because I've often thought the event industry needs to stop that model. And I think this could be a very, very, very good thing in stopping the model. But to your point, Ashley, that is a massive increase in staff. And then the other thing, for one of our clients who wants to do a big testing facility to get 1,000 people through in a couple hours, we're going to have the experts do that part, but we're going to have to staff the funneling of the humans through. That is a huge increase for staffing and our clients. And what we're finding is clients are thinking, because there's less people on site, you're going to be cheaper. And it's like, no, what we have to do with the people has gone up in complexity. We've never had to test it. And again, I go to the then what? If we're going to test 1,000 people and 3 are positive, now I've got a staffing issue to do the then what, whatever the then what is, put them up in a hotel, make sure we've got the paper, we've got a then what. All of that, even if you decrease your amount of attendees by 30%, our fees are actually inversely increasing. And that is a very tricky thing. And I'm sure internally, that's also budget implications if you have to double up on those people. So I'll just say, I don't know that we have the answer, but I will say the one thing we're doing is, like I said, the remote with a transfer, because I care about my people feeling very valued and valuable on these events they've worked on forever. But if they don't want to go, we understand that. We're going to staff up on site. We're going to have a longer baton pass. And then once they're on site, we're also working through what makes you comfortable being here. Do we need to sign something that Caspian says, we will pay for you for a 2-week quarantine if you get stuck? And then do you fly in people's parents, which then is medevac insurance? Take care of them, family. Does their husband, wife, wives, husbands, theys, do you bring the people around them? And that's another whole thing when somebody's sick or heaven forbid in hospital or something like that. So, and your staff is probably going to want that reassurance.
No, that's super helpful. Thank you.
Those are incredible points. Jana, go ahead.
My unicorn mug person. I want to go grab him right now.
I mostly have a clarification question because I want to make sure I clearly understand the HIPAA thing. So it's mostly a protection so that institutions can't share with other institutions people's medical information, but we say as folks running an event could require proof of vaccination to ensure the health and safety of our attendees. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, there's only one little fine point I would put on it. HIPAA only applies and is applicable if you are a healthcare organization. HIPAA has no relevance to your life if you are not a healthcare organization. So if I was a hospital or healthcare clinic and you were a hospital or healthcare clinic, I cannot give you records for my patients. That's it. Now, if you go into GDPR, which is the data protection records, that's a different thing where you wouldn't want necessarily, you'd want to know you're keeping GDPR, any information on your attendees stays with you, but that applies to their email, their name, their address, you know what I mean? You can't send that stuff to me as an event organizer with your attendee list if they've never said, yeah, you could share it with Heather Caspian, no problem. And that would include their vaccine information, but truly, that's just because that's just like their email. You cannot give me your attendees' information for my event if they did not allow you to share it with your partners. Then we would have crossed the GDPR boundary.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for also adding that.
So many good questions. So I don't see any other hands raised. Does anyone have any final questions for Heather or Carl before we kind of do last thoughts and wrap up? And you don't have to raise your hand. You can just unmute or drop in the chat. Okay, great. I don't see one.
One of my little goals in life for all y'all to know, so if you ever know of a good online program, I think it'd be so fun to get a law degree. I get bummed every time. I have to say I'm not a lawyer. I really want to be a lawyer. I wanted to be a lawyer when I was a little kid. I like it. It appeals to my logic. So one of these days, if you guys hear of a good online program, that's probably what I could do. Because I will say I am optimist, but I live in my realist hat and my logic hat, and it pleases my soul. But thank you, everyone, for all the great questions. These were super helpful. And as you all gather more experience in this, as we're all going through it, as you see case law, as you see different country law, for those people, I know I saw Mexico attending, I saw Belgium attending. I don't know if I got everybody, Canada, couple other ones. Please let us know how your country is also adapting, because we're all, I think, global producers, and I think it's going to be a patchwork quilt for a while that's pretty tricky to navigate. So that was it, Missy.
Yeah.
And I want to say thank you, Carl, because I made you attend today.
Thank you, Carl. Great.
Always a pleasure to carry wood for you, Heather. Just watch.
Amazing. Awesome. So thank you everyone for attending. We are going to send out the deck and a recording of this call, and we'll post it on our website as well. And then we'll follow up with everyone who registered about the training series, about other aspects of hybrid and in-person events in late September and early October. And Heather will be our expert again and dig into her white paper and all the different types of hybrid she's seeing. And ideally, we'll also have a lot more information about all the different types of events people have hosted at this point, and some thoughts there. So Heather, if you want to drop your email in the chat, we'll also share Heather and Carl's contact information. But otherwise, let's go ahead and wrap it up. And a big thank you for everyone who attended, and Heather and Carl for providing your amazing wisdom and experience.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Happy Tuesday.
Everyone.
Happy Tuesday.
Thank you, Jana.
Hmm.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.